Good afternoon. My name is John Law. I am the Vice Dean of the faculty, and it's my pleasure to serve as your moderator for our second panel, which is entitled Circumstances. While people are still joining us, I perhaps will take a minute to share with you my observations on the conference to date. It struck me with a great deal of chagrin, I must admit, that I apparently employ a 19th century pedagogy or methodology in teaching a 20th century subject to 21st century lawyers. It gave me some trouble, and then I was comforted by the fact that in so doing I am offering my admin law students an experiential class in legal history, which is another one of my teaching activities. They can live it as well as endure it. And so I guess, at the end of the day, in my own twisted sense of humor and mind, I am cutting edge. The purpose of this panel is to set some context for the challenges confronting legal education in Canada and other jurisdictions, to offer some suggestions for future directions, and so this panel, as with others, will overlap to a degree. This is not surprising in the case of a subject with some history and certainly a great deal of complexity. Our panelists are a distinguished group, each able to offer a different perspective on contemporary legal education and its challenges. We have two deans, one from the East, Dean Kim Brooks, Dean of Law, Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University. That always causes me pause. It will always be to me Dalhousie University. She is joined by the Western Dean, Ian Holloway, Dean of Law at the University of Calgary. Past life, he was Dean of Law at the University of Western Ontario, which I'm told is now known as Western. Only Ontario could name a law school located in the southeastern corner of the province, Western. I don't know what it says about Ontario's horizons, but maybe they are as limited as is rumored. John Hunter, a senior and distinguished litigation counsel at Hunter Litigation Chambers, will be our next panelist. He is a former president of the Federation of Law Societies, which has been active as a centralizing or nationalizing force in Canadian legal profession in recent years. It has also been, as our previous speaker indicated, a somewhat polarizing force in Canadian legal education. His task force, which produced a report called The Content of the Canadian Common Law Degree, caused some degree of consternation in the Canadian Legal Academy, which some may see has been off-leash for too long or far too long. And finally, we are joined by Margaret Thornton, a professor of law at Australian National University and a barrister of the Supreme Court of New South Wales and the High Court of Australia. She will bring a comparative comparison or perspective to our Canadian experience. I think we have certainly all the raw material for an excellent panel, and I, for one, look forward to their presentations. If you want to look at their more expanded biographies, I invite you to consider page 17, then flip over to page 18 in the participants' biographies in the conference program. Each speaker has been warned that they will take no more than 20 minutes in their presentation, so as to allow us 10 or so minutes for questions and comments at the end of the panel. I would ask members of the audience to do what apparently you are doing well, and that is to speak up or to use the microphones when asking a question or making a comment so that everyone may benefit from the answer or response. Finally, and this causes me some degree of discomfort, I suppose. It's just not something I do well. I want to recognize the financial support of the conference sponsors. I keep having a desire to say, and this panel is brought to you by, and it really doesn't resonate well in an academic conference. One of which sponsored this panel, and we're appreciative of the support of Field Law, one of Edmonton's oldest and most distinguished firms. And then I'm going to do what apparently I do best, and that is fill in for a printing gap in the program. I am also to remind you that the reception which will follow this panel was brought to you by Torrey's LLP, and their name was not contained in the program. So with that, I call upon our first panelist, Dean Kim Brooks from Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University, and she'll be speaking on what the world needs is more Rod McDonalds. Dean Brooks.
So the world needs more Rod McDonald, a taxonomy of renovations. Rod McDonald has the perfect office at McGill, room 301 of 3674 Peel Street. His office is a room in an old house. The dark wood interior of the house feels like it still remembers the trees it came from. When you walk up the stairs to Rod's office, and there are only stairs because the building is not accessible, your left hand is drawn to rest on the top of the newel post. This building feels like the kind of place you could think big thoughts, if big thoughts were an option, given your genetic and social educational endowments. The rumor is that the house was an enormous one-family home that at some stage was split into two separate living spaces so that sisters could live together. It seems fitting that Rod finds his work home in this house, given his contributions to the way we think about the interdependence of human relationships in law. Rod's office has seen better days, as have most languishing university buildings that haven't had what we gently refer to as the deferred maintenance work done. Nevertheless, it is spectacular. It faces east, which must be fine for Rod because he's a morning man, often in his office by 4 a.m. It has a turret window and partially separated reading space. The walls are lined with bookshelves that look like they could be more securely attached. When you walk into the room, Rod is often sitting in his chair, leaning in toward the monitor of his desktop computer, peering into the screen, face fixed in a slight scowl. Who knows what he is typing or how long he has been sitting there? When he turns to face you, his face lights up and he grins. He'll insist you sit down, flapping one of his seemingly endless arms in the general direction of the seating space to your right. More often than not, he'll stay sitting in his chair, return to scowling at his computer, and type furiously for a few more minutes, finishing a thought. I use that time to flop down on his couch 3 panels long. When I wait for him, usually lying on the couch, arms crossed behind my head, staring at the ceiling, I wonder what it is he thinks about all the time. Eventually, Rod will extract himself from his chair and tear himself away from the computer. He'll wander over to the space where I'm stretched out. He'll sit like a cat, not a docile cat, but a tentative, slightly anxious cat. A cat who's contemplating departing at any moment on a chair that faces the couch. What I've learned about Rod is that if you wait for him to say something first, just enjoying the quiet of his office in this extraordinary old building in this marvelous law school, he will eventually say something completely unexpected. One day, while I'm lying there staring at the ceiling, wondering what he will say, he blurts out, "I think we should teach all of first year through the lens of some regular object. Cars! Forget obligations and property. Imagine that we taught all of first year through something rooted in everyday life. Something that centered real people for whom law is made." Imagine teaching all of first year, as though the human beings so entangled in law mattered most. What would that look like? The idea was so outrageous that I think I laughed. Imagine teaching at a law school that had already made massive, fundamental change to the curriculum and being willing to think about yet one more way of revisioning it from the ground up. I don't think we pursued the idea for long. I was likely in his office for some practical advice about where to submit something for publication or to kick around some small bit of administrivia. But that idea, like so many of the ideas Rod threw around casually in conversations I've had with him, stayed with me. What I wish most for the future of legal education is that we could have more conversations in the vein of Rod and fewer conversations in the vein of whether a particular course, just to illustrate, should find itself in the first or second year of the mandatory program. Before the 1970s, there was a trickle of research on the state of the practice of law and the interaction between that practice and legal education. Between the 1970s and a few years ago, that literature grew incrementally in scope and depth. In the last 5 years, certainly since 2007's Carnegie Report and the 2008 economic crisis, the literature exploded, with organizations and regulators in Canada, the United States, Australia, and the UK producing myriad dense reports on the state of the Union. Given the wealth of material already available, this is not the place to reiterate in any detail the challenging context for legal education or the practice of law that has given rise to the sense that legal education and the practice of law are in a state of rapid, unfamiliar change. But in short, Over the last decade or two, we have observed the massification of university education, including in some jurisdictions of legal education, documented the continued exit of women from private practice, fretted about the exorbitant cost of legal services, heard judges rail about the high numbers of self-represented litigants, seen diminishing government funding for legal work, including cuts to legal aid and more recently reductions in positions for lawyers at justice and other government departments, studied the high rates of depression and substance abuse among practicing lawyers, witnessed the facility with which at least some legal services can be provided using new technologies and ease with which non-lawyers can use technology to learn a good deal of law without the help of a lawyer, move towards an increasingly deregulated market for at least some kinds of legal services, worried about the long-term viability of outdated law firm business models and billing practices, facilitated greater jurisdictional mobility for lawyers, written about and in some cases seen evidence of the disaggregation of legal work products and the potential for outsourcing of at least some legal work to entirely different parts of the world, been engaged in changes to the design of the articling process, increased student debt with high tuitions at both the undergraduate and law school stages, recognizes the trend toward colonization and worse conformity, and wailed over evidence that much of the population remains under or unserved. This context has resulted in a flurry of attention to legal education and the practice of law. It has been some time since legal education was news that made the pages of the New York Times on a regular basis. The book industry has stayed afloat in dying times for publishing, in no small measure because of the pandemic of books, reminding us that the end of legal education, the practice of law, and life as we know it is nigh. And the number and volume of conferences, workshops, task forces, and studies undertaken in Canada, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom in the last 5 years easily dwarf everything undertaken on this subject in the last century. In the face of mounting evidence that the world is changing and changing rapidly, the question is, how should law schools respond? The ABA Task Force on the Future of Education released a draft report last week, and I disagree with all of it. But they did identify a major impediment to responding to challenges like the ones I just reviewed as the culture of resistance to change in law schools and the legal profession. As asserted in the draft report, the culture of law schools is at the root of many aspects of current conditions. It is a culture of customs and practice that developed when decision-making involved consideration of modest changes that could be implemented over relatively long time frames. Today's challenges require a much stronger culture of innovation. The description of the culture of resistance at law schools resonates with me. For all kinds of reasons, we are slow to change. As faculty members, we guard our autonomy carefully. We're reluctant to admit when we're wrong or that we could do better. Quixotically, we're anxious about what we're doing and wonder whether we're doing it as well as we could be, although in my experience that anxiety tends to lead us towards conservative approaches as opposed to riskier efforts. Scholarship is hard work and requires enormous internal motivation, and we worry that overspending time on other projects will distract us from that hard part of the job, and we're trained incrementalists. I'm sure there are myriad other reasons, and my purpose here is not to list them in a complete way, but simply to nod at the possible explanations for the challenges law schools face when contemplating and implementing changes in response to a rapidly changing world. What I want to do in the small amount of time that remains in my talk is provide a brief tour of some of the renovations detailed in my paper that we might consider under each of the familiar heads of the provision of legal education: admissions, curriculum, pedagogy, research, and community service. In the paper itself, I deal with each of those areas in some detail. The purpose of this exercise is not to generate a roadmap of prescriptions for the directions of legal education. In fact, the more I learn about legal education and the practice of law, the less sure I am I have any fixed or firm idea about the best or right way forward. Instead, the paper will hopefully spark discussion about possibilities and options. For the purposes of today, I'll speak only to the admissions portions of the paper, in part because it is the briefest. As a final point, I might note at the outset that some of the context I set out above, I don't care about at all. I don't think it even matters. But I set it out because it might be motivating for others. My view is that we should be pervasively engaged in conversations about big ideas and more modest renovations in the design of legal education. In fact, that part of the joy of being an academic is spending some time each year thinking about what we might do differently and possibly, but not necessarily, better. To that end, the sky is falling is entirely irrelevant. A better contextual list, which would more aptly frame a conversation about new directions for law schools and legal education, would be thicker. It might explore which segments of the labor market have become more mobile, the effect of rising income and wealth inequality on society, the evidence of the effectiveness of corporate mergers, the implications of food scarcity, and so on. In short, we might focus our context-setting attentions on current human and public policy dilemmas. We would focus on the kinds of public policy problems we hope our students will respond to when they graduate from the school. To build on Gillian's stolen analogy from yesterday, we would talk more about the kinds of holes we want to make or whether we want to make holes at all, and less about whether we want to change the color of the drill from black to a very, very dark gray. So if it isn't already clear, in the context of the way the world is changing and given the public policy and other human problems our students will face on graduation, I am in favor of big projects. Canadian law schools are surprisingly heterogeneous, made all the more so by the efforts of the Federation of Canadian Law Societies. For each aspect of the law school program in the paper, I try to do three things. One, provide some brief context about the way things have unfolded for that aspect of law school design, highlighting as inspiration a moment or two where I think that aspect of law school life was transformed in the past. Two, suggest some design principles that might be invoked to evaluate the appropriateness of any proposed big ideas. And three, propose one possible major change that responds to that context and aligns with those principles. There's no magic to the ideas proposed. On a different writing day, I might have worked on something else. For example, I'm not adverse to a 2-year JD program, particularly if the law school isn't otherwise inclined to distinguish what students are intended to learn in their third year. To articulating explicit learning objectives for legal education and allowing students to graduate when they demonstrate competence at those objectives, taking a 2-, 3-, or 4-year program. To setting admissions thresholds for entrance and then drawing students' names out of a hat, as opposed to rank ordering them by grades, LSAT, or some other variable or two, or to submitting names to a computer program that would admit students not as individuals but as a diverse entering class with the broadest possible range of life experience, ideological perspectives, racial identities, geographic affinities, and so on. To requiring students to participate for credit in a law school firm with the major object of improving access to justice for middle-income people, and so on. Those just were not the ideas I chose to explore in this paper. The point is not to ossify a set of directions, but rather to demonstrate that there are big ideas out there that could be pursued, and to urge us to consider that the timing might be appropriate for some more dramatic innovation, or at least renovation, in the design of law schools. There can't have been much appealing about Keystone, now Breton, Alberta, for anyone who arrived in 1911. One imagines that the farmers who set up homesteads in the region early in the 20th century would have faced harsh winters, limited food supplies, and widely dispersed populations. John King's experience would have had those features, and layered upon them would have been the realization that as an African-American farmer relocating from Oklahoma to Keystone, he was entering an environment hostile not only to human existence, but also to his race. By 1912, surprised, I suppose, to find African Americans responding to their settlement call, the Canadian government took steps to discourage African Americans from immigrating. But by then, key historical moments for the University of Alberta's Faculty of Law and the practice of law had been set in motion. John King and his wife Stella moved to Calgary in 1919. He took up working as a sleeping car porter. She was a seamstress. Violet was born in 1929 and from at least her high school days knew she wanted to be a lawyer. Violet's first year in law school was 1950-51, and she graduated, the first African-Canadian student to graduate from the law school, in 1953. She articled with Edward J. McCormick, QC, a criminal lawyer in Calgary, working on 5 murder trials in her articling year, and she was called to the bar in 1954. Violet King became the first African-Canadian female lawyer in Canada. According to the limited accounts of her life, Violet practiced criminal law for a couple years, then left practice to join the Federal Department of Citizenship and Immigration in 1956. She worked for some time in Ottawa. By 1963, she'd moved to the United States, where she held a number of senior management positions in the YMCA. She died of cancer in 1981 or 1982 without announcement. I'm grateful to Rachel Bailey, who rehabilitated something of Violet's stories in the pages of the Canadian Journal of Women in Law last year. Violet's admission to law school at the University of Alberta in 1952 marked a transition time for admissions programs across the country. Although women and African Canadians had entered many of the country's law schools almost a half a century earlier, it wasn't until some time after Violet's arrival that women began entering law school in large numbers. The sex diversity of the law school class, alongside the move to adjudicate admissions files by more, quote, objective measures like undergraduate grades and LSATs, came in the early 1970s. Those changes reflect watershed moments in Canadian law school admissions policy. It has been some time then since admissions practices at Canadian law schools find themselves in a transformative moment. This might, however, be such a moment. For some time, at least since the mid-1970s, law school admissions at common law schools in Canada have been highly restricted. A relatively small number of common law schools, 16, admit approximately 4,500 students. Almost every student admitted to law school passes the program. Almost every student who graduates from a Canadian law school and writes the bars of a province passes those exams. Almost every student who passes the bar exam secures an articling position and is admitted to practice. For a good 40 years, the barrier to entry to the legal profession in Canada has been admission to a Canadian law school. However, the last several years have seen marked changes to admission and to the practice of law. 2 new law schools have joined the cluster of common law schools. Total enrollment at the original 16 schools has crept up, and our National Committee on Accreditation has seen exponential increases in applications to practice law in Canada year over year. In the last year alone, 709 certificates were issued, which makes the NCA the largest Canadian law school with the fastest increase in enrollment, and there are no signs that the pace of applications from foreign-trained lawyers and foreign-trained students to the practice of law in Canada is going to decline. Until recently, regulatory bodies have been able to essentially rely on high admission standards, as measured by grades and LSATs, to serve as the barrier to entry to the practice of law. Frankly, on my bad teaching day, when I teach our students, I think they are so bright that there is nothing I could do to get in the way of their competence. Essentially, my classes are a deadline for them to do the reading, and sometimes they're not even that. Now, though, regulators have a much thornier question to answer. If the law school admission process changes, or the ways through which students are able to get access to the practice of law is changing and expanding, how will they know when a person is an effective lawyer? For law schools, this moment, with the growing number of Canadian students pursuing legal education abroad, and essentially sidestepping the historic barrier to access to professional practice in Canada, presents the kind of moment that the influx of a more diverse group of students might have presented in Violet King's day. Fortunately, law schools are not constrained by the regulatory pressures of law societies. Although we have functioned as the de facto regulator of admission to the practice of law, we no longer need, informally or otherwise, to serve that function. Given the increasing numbers of ways students access to legal information, Given the increasing number of ways students have access to legal information, are being educated, and are arriving at the doors of the regulator, law schools are liberated from the sense that we need to serve as the informal barrier to entry to the profession. Given that kind of context, what kinds of principles should govern the design of our admissions projects? 1, to the extent that a law school uses measures to predict law school success, they should be free from bias. In some instances, the low cost of using LSAT scores as a predictor may be too overwhelming for a school to resist. In those cases, though, statistically reliable compensatory curving should be developed in an effort to compare racialized students, for example, with other applicants. 2, law schools should articulate clear objectives for their admissions policies. Are we trying to attract the students who will best perform in our programs? Are we trying to attract students who are likely, based on their past experiences, to make significant contributions to the legal profession and civil society? Are we trying to attract a diverse group of students, geographically, racially, ideologically, in terms of their articulated aspirations? Would we like to attract students with demonstrated commitment to solving public policy and other human problems? Whatever our objectives, they should be informed by the aspirations we have as public institutions for the difference we hope our students will make. 3rd, law schools should delineate skills, talents, and attitudes that we want our students to have on admissions and distinguish those from skills, talents, and attitudes we intend to develop when students are engaged in the study at our schools. We should be clear about what students should learn in law school. Here's one suggestion for law schools to consider in renovating admissions. Start admitting students based on their likelihood of success in the profession and as jurists. Admissions processes have evolved in response, largely, to predictors of law school success. However, other professions like medicine have made some headway in redesigning their admission practices to align them with predictors of career success. That work has been made harder in law because of the dearth of research on what makes a good lawyer, assuming that one is selecting students who may wish to practice law or be jurists, and on what might predict what makes a good lawyer. But fascinating research is being done, finally, and progress is being made. In 2011, Marjorie Schultz and Sheldon Zadak published a wonderful piece predicting lawyer effectiveness, broadening the basis for law school admissions decisions. In that piece, which builds on what looks like at least 10 years of work together, they document 26 factors as important for lawyer effectiveness. Analysis and reading, creativity, innovation, problem-solving, practice judgment, researching the law, fact-finding, questioning and interviewing, influencing and advocating, writing, speaking, listening, strategic planning, organizing and managing one's own work, organizing and managing others, negotiation skills, ability to see the world through the eyes of others, networking and business development, providing advice and counseling and building relationships with clients, developing relationships within the legal profession, evaluation, development and mentoring, passion and engagement, diligence, integrity and honesty, stress management, community involvement, service, and self-development. The terrific thing about this list is that these strike me without testing as characteristics of people in most of the kinds of careers our students will pursue, not only in traditional legal practice settings. Schultz and Zedek find that if 2 tests they've developed over the years measure those skills, a biological information data test and a situational judgment test, that correlate with 24 and 23 of those 26 measures of lawyer effectiveness respectively. The LSAT and undergraduate grades were found to correlate with very few of the 26 factors. Additionally, the tests for lawyer effectiveness showed few racial or gender differences. In other words, these tests move away from some well-documented bias of the LSAT for racialized students. One big project for admissions would be to move away, at least for some students, from the historic measures of law school success in the design of legal education and towards new measures of career effectiveness. Imagine a school that took seriously the project of admitting those students likely to make the most important contributions to the legal profession, in whatever positions, and took less seriously the project of admitting students who would perform well on end-of-term exams. Let me conclude. The vision of the University of Alberta is to inspire the human spirit. It seems fitting then to think about this paper in the context of this place, not only because inspiring the human spirit is one of the most complex, big projects, but because the financial conditions under which the university is being called upon to pursue that vision are challenging and make the stakes all the higher. In his convocation speech on accepting an honorary degree from York University in 2011, Rod MacDonald remarked, "The measure of a person is not where you start or even where you end up. It is found in what you make of your life, what you do with the opportunities you've been given, and those you've striven to create for yourself." As the distinctly Canadian legal academy, with a context that's both familiar and unique to other common law jurisdictions around the world, I can hope no less for us, that we will not be contented with accepting things as they are, in the face of significant evidence that the world is changing, but rather that we will make more of the opportunities we have been given, and that we will strive to create unexpected opportunities for ourselves. Thank you.